Thank you, thank you. It's great to be here. We want to talk to you today about something that might be a little bit controversial, mixing Angular and React. And so I know that we're at a React or an Angular conference, excuse me. Well, everyone here only ever writes Angular, right? Is that true? Not true, probably. I think a lot of us dabble in things like React, at least I do myself. And we want to talk to you today about how you can start to think about using them together. So my name is Ryan, and I'm a full-stack developer. I'm a consultant. I do a lot of full-stack application builds for companies. I use Angular quite a bit, React as well, and Node.js. This is my pal, Brad.
I'm Brad, and like Lewis said, I'm a Sapphire Digital employee, software engineering lead. I spend most of my time in Angular, but because of my previous history now, I actually got tasked to do a lot of DevOps, so I've been doing a lot of Terraform and that kind of stuff too. But I do want to be like Ryan when I grow up, so.
So I think if we were to look around, we would see that things in the JavaScript ecosystem are starting to mature a little bit, starting to stabilize. If you were around back in 2015 and 16, it may have seemed like every week there was a new framework, and everyone was getting FOMO, fear of missing out, because they wanted to learn everything new, and it felt like we had to keep up. There's still many more frameworks than just what we've got here, Angular, Vue, and React, but I would tend to say that we're stabilizing on the big three, the red, green, and blue of JavaScript. Now, I think most people might tend to have this picture of things. You know, if there's a company that needs to pick a framework, they might pick Angular, and they might stick with that for all of their technology. Everything across every product is all in that one framework. Then you might have another company, and they might choose something like React, and they might stick with that for everything that they do. And then you might have a third company that that tends to miss the old days, and they choose Vue, and that's all they're ever going to use. In reality, though, it doesn't look quite like this, I don't think.
No, really, it looks like this Foo Corp, they have Angular, but then they went and bought somebody else, and now they have React. So they got two different frameworks in there, and then they bought someone else that also has React, and then they bought someone that, they used Vue, and it keeps going, it keeps going. They get legacy stuff in there, and it just becomes a big mess.
Right, so one of the issues that we've got here is that sharing code between these apps can get kind of difficult. And in particular, it gets difficult when we want to think about sharing components. You know, you can make a library, you can have kind of a shared library with helper functions, for example, that you share across every different application. But if you want to get down to the component level and actually share components between these frameworks, that gets to be a little bit difficult. So what if instead, though, we could, my clicker is kind of freaking out.
Nice.
What if we could use something like a custom element, right? Something that looks like HTML and behaves kind of just like a regular DOM element. And what if we could have sort of a private DOM around this, where it doesn't bleed out interactions to the outside world unless we explicitly want to. Styling is scoped to that element, etc. And then more importantly, what if we could share these elements between different frameworks, regardless of what that framework might be? So the good news is that with a technology that you've probably heard of, standard you may have heard of, called web components, we can make this happen. Web components are basically something that allows us to create custom elements. The element can be whatever name we want to give it, and we consume it just like we would any other HTML element. And this is done with the Custom Elements API. So a browser API that allows us to register the names of these custom elements that we create, and then consume them like we would any other HTML element. Now, as with most things that are relatively new, support isn't the best yet. The typical suspects are lagging behind a bit, but things are getting better all the time. And we've got polyfills to help us out if we need to support browsers that aren't as caught up.
Even Edge?
Even Edge.
I mean, Edge is supposed to be new.
Yeah. So, sounds pretty cool. What are people saying about these web components? Turns out, not everyone is all that jazzed up about them. There's a lot of opinions out there where people, they don't really like this idea of web components. If you've been reading the JavaScript news recently, you may have seen things like this, people kind of giving their stories as to why they don't use web components. And then, of course, the retorts from people who are fond of web components. So we see a lot of stuff like this in the community where there's this back and forth, you know, should I use them, should I not use them? And here's the thing. If you are building an application in Angular, nothing beats Angular for building components. Same thing with React. Nothing is going to beat React for building your components, and Vue, and on and on. But if you do need to support multiple different frameworks, which is becoming more and more common these days. If you do need to share components between different applications, then web components can really help. And we would argue that Angular elements provide one of the best ways to create these web components. And there's a few different reasons for this. So why build your web components with Angular elements? Well, they have a great developer experience. We've got the typical Angular APIs that we know and love. We've got the Angular CLI to help us out with things. We've also got great documentation and content. I'm sure we're all fans of the effort that goes into the Angular documentation. And I think the best overall experience, because you've got the Angular community behind you to help you create these web components, again, via Angular elements. So, enough about the theory. Let's see how it works.
All right. So, I'm pretty sure hopefully most of you are familiar with a thing called NASA, which is the North American Space Agency, I think. That's terribly embarrassing. All right. So let's imagine an ideal world where NASA actually loves Angular, and we actually know that they do. So this is good. It's no longer an ideal world. One of the projects that NASA works on is the International Space Station, or the ISS. And on the ISS, there is a very important piece of equipment called the discombobulator. Now, if this discombobulator gets too hot, bad things can happen, and you do not want bad things happening in space because it's space. So what they did is they created demo time. They created a Angular dashboard, and they created a temperature component so that they could monitor the temperature of this discombobulator. So they put it in their Angular app. It's an Angular dashboard. Everything's great. Let's look at that demo. There it is.
Wrong one. That's the one.
That's it.
So I'm going to start.
So start the temperature updatinator, please.
All right.
All right. So you can see the temperature is kind of hanging out and doing a little thing, going up and down a little bit. But when Ryan triggers the high temp alert, you're going to see that it went too high. NASA was alerted on the dashboard, and we got this big banner at the top that says, warning, high temperature. So that is their normal dashboard. Well, everything is good. So this is the American Space Station, right?
Typical American in Europe.
Yes. So it is not the American Space Station, or AKA the ASS. It is the International Space Station. And as such, then we know that there are other space agencies that want to also be able to monitor the discombobulator temperature. But they don't really want to have to switch to Angular if they're not using Angular, or they don't want to have to rewrite the component and everything. So they asked NASA what we could do about that. So NASA put their heads together, their big NASA heads, and came up with an idea. They don't use Angular. They know that. Forgot that slide. The best solution is a web component using Angular elements. That's what they decided to do. So how do we do that? We're going to transform an Angular component into an Angular element. Yes.
That's worth watching again. Let's see that again.
I'm just going to sit here and watch this for a while. Yeah.
It's great.
That kind of freaked me out the first time I saw it. I'm like, oosh. All right, cool. So anyway, moving on. So the first thing we do is we need to add Angular elements, and thanks to the fancy ng-add stuff, we can do that by ng-add at Angular elements. And then, because it's going to be an element and it's not going to operate quite like an actual full Angular app, we have to manually bootstrap it, and we do that using the create custom element from Angular elements, pass in our component, pass in the injector, and then we use the browser API, the custom elements API, to define our selector with our element so that the browser will know that it needs to render that. And since it's not quite bootstrapped the same way, it becomes dynamic, and we have to add it to the entry components. And then what we can do is we can just rip out app root, assuming we have just this one component in our Angular app. We'll replace it with our Angular component, our temperature gauge, pass in the relevant inputs, and we're off to the races. So we do ng serve, and when you do that, you get this error. Failed to construct HTML element, please use the new operator. Well, what does that mean? What it means is we targeted ES5. And if you target ES5, you have to do polyfills. You need to install web components, custom elements, polyfills, and you have the native shim, And then you have the custom elements polyfill so that the browsers without support will know what to do. Now, if you target ES 2015 as of Angular 8 with the differential loading, you won't need the native shim anymore, but you might need the custom elements polyfill depending on the browser choice. But if you do target ES 2015, then you've got your files that are ES 2015 files and ES5 files. Now, taking that outside of Angular, you would have to kind of roll your own differential loading or come up with some way to tell it which file for what browser, and that's kind of a pain. So there's no differential loading at this point with this stuff. So I would suggest targeting ES5, not 2015, 5 for now. So let's look at our new Angular elementized thing. Would you please reset the thing?
Yeah.
Thanks.
There you go.
All right, so this is running just in a static site HTML thing, just the Angular element. And if Ryan triggers the high temp, then you'll see that the component still works, but we didn't get any kind of warning on the thing because we've taken it outside of that app. All right, moving on. All right, so we've got our element. It's all nicely packaged Angular-wise, but we need to distribute it out to all these other agencies. We're going to do that with Manfred's NGX build plus. Where's Manfred? Somewhere? Nowhere? OK. And NPM. And we do that with ng-add again, ngx build plus. And what this does, it updates our builder and to use ngx build plus as our builder. And it gives us a couple of flags, single bundle and keep polyfills. And then all we do is we update our build script to use the prod flag and those two new flags, single bundle and keep polyfills. And we run build. And then we get these. This is our dist folder. So if you target ES5, you can see you have the main.js, polyfills.js, and scripts.js. And with 2015, you have 2 files of each kind, which makes it difficult if you're taking it outside of Angular. So again, if you're going to do this, I would target ES5 for now until we figure out the whole differential loading thing. All right, and then we're going to package it with NPM. So in order to package with NPM, you have to have a package.json file. And if you store that in your dist folder, as soon as you build again, it's going to get wiped out. So what I like to do is keep this in the assets folder and just copy it over, automatically increment the version to make publishing easy, and we're off to the races. So you run npm pack, and you get your TGZ file, which is your nicely packaged, zipped up file for publishing to NPM registry. All right, now let's see what we do with this with React.
All right, so we've been talking about Angular so far. We're going to look at the React case next. I don't know if it translates so much in Europe, but Brad and people from his country make fun of me because I say JavaScript, whereas he says JavaScript. That's because I come from Canada, a little country to the north of Brad, who comes from the US. And we've got some different ways of saying certain words, like JavaScript. But because I'm Canadian, my favorite space agency happens to be the CSA, the Canadian Space Agency, which you probably have never heard of, but that's OK. The Canadian Space Agency, in our ideal world, uses React for their mission control. They've got a lot of the same kind of concerns in taking part in the International Space Station that NASA does, and they want to have the same kind of ability to see what's going on the space station. But they don't want to go and rebuild everything that NASA's already built. They want to share this code, share these components that NASA's taken the time to craft. And thankfully, because we are using Angular elements, we've got something that's ready to go to be consumed wherever we want. So because we packaged it up and published it to NPM, it's really just a matter of installing that element, NPM install the package name, and then we just drop it into our application. There may be a couple things you've got to do to set your project up so that you can consume this element, but more or less, it's just a matter of dropping it in like this. Because we're in Canada, we do much like you do here in Europe, and we use the correct unit of temperature, in this case Celsius, and we can set up any other kind of options on our components that it might accept. Now, a little bit of difficulty that we might have if we're using this Angular element in React is that the way that we listen for events, there's a little bit of work, at least right now, that needs to go on to be able to listen for them. So we might be tempted to think that we can do something like this, where we've got an event handler, which maybe then we run a method against so that we can run some action when that event is emitted. But it doesn't work quite this way, unfortunately, in React land. The way to do it, though, the workaround, is that you would set up a ref on your element. This is a React thing where it's like a reference to that DOM node. And inside that ref, what we can do is point it to some local member to hold that reference. And then we can kind of like do another little bit of magic here to point that reference to the actual node. Once we have that, and we've set it up so that ref equals this.handleRef, we can go ahead, and when the component mounts, for example, we can set up an event listener to listen for that high temperature event. So it's a little bit crufty this way, because you've got to do a bit of extra work to set yourself up to listen for events. But once we do this, we can do things that we would want to do in our React application, like set some state, for example, when certain events are emitted. When we unmount the component, we want to remove that event listener to clean up afterwards. So what this means is that, let's say we get the high temperature event emitted, we get that event out of the Angular element, out of that component. And we don't just get the fact that an event was emitted, we get information out of it. So we've got things like the alert detail, the name of the alert, the temperature that we've got, all sorts of things that can be emitted with an event can be consumed then in another place like React. So let's see, it's the first one over. OK, so this is our React application consuming the Angular element. So what you're seeing here with the temperature rising and falling, that's all Angular. Everything around it, though, is React. So let's do a high temperature warning. OK, so we've got our high temperature warning. That is actually from the React application. And it's shown because we're setting some state to say that we want to show that when we get a high temp warning. So this is really cool and noteworthy because we are building something completely in Angular, and we're saying that we can communicate with the outside world via events. Then it's up to whichever application, wherever it's being consumed, it's up to that app to respond in a certain way to those events. Let's go back. All right. So the cool thing here, too, is, again, because it's a web component, it can be used anywhere. So what is it, the ESA, the European Space Agency, I think, right? If they use Vue.js, for example, we can just share it with them and drop it right in. So this is pretty cool. It seems like this might solve a lot of problems. But is this a good idea? Brad, what do you think?
Maybe. Let's look at why it might not be a good idea first. And one of those reasons, and a big reason, is bundle size. Depending on what you have going on in that component, it can get really big. Now, Ivy isn't here yet, and it's supposed to help with that, but it's still unclear on the Angular element side if it is actually going to reduce that as drastically as we think. But there's one other thing, that if you need to do content projection, you just can't do that. So content child, it just doesn't, it's not an elements thing, and it just won't work. But why it might be a good idea is if you're upgrading from AngularJS. So a big bank, Capital One, did this exact thing where they had their whole site built in AngularJS, and they wanted to upgrade it, but they couldn't really do a big bang upgrade. So they started taking little components and putting them into Angular elements and putting them back in AngularJS. And it was a really smooth transition, and I don't even know if they're done yet. I think they might be done. I don't really know. They're not done? Oh, OK, it's going to be a year. So they're just doing that, and everything runs smoothly and awesomely. Now, one other good reason is familiarity with the framework. If you have a lot of Angular devs and the stuff, then it makes it great. As you buy other companies or whatever, you get all these different frameworks involved, then you can still use what you're familiar with and not have to learn and spend time learning something else, just to pull them in and get rid of it at some point. And Ivy is coming, but still it's unclear as to how that is going to help with Angular elements.
All right, so another way that you can start to work with Angular and React together is with a set of tools provided by Narwhal called NX, and that's Narwhal Extensions. So Narwhal Extensions, a set of tools to help you build monorepos in a really smart way so that you can work with any kind of front end that you want and any kind of, I think, almost any kind of back end, really, all in the same monorepo. It's giving you tools to make parts work together. So if you wanted to use NX for if you've got an Angular and a React project, for example, pretty simple to wire up the workspace and then create some applications within it. Just a few commands. NX gives a set of tools where you can where they extend the CLI, and they also provide their own CLI as well. So you've got two different options for CLI use. But yeah, some commands to generate some applications. And then you can create a space within that workspace where you've got this lib folder where you can start to share code between different applications. And that's a place where you could put your custom elements, for example, your Angular elements. When we are going to use Angular elements within within this monorepo, we'd want to set the custom elements schema on our schemas here in our ng module. And that just tells Angular that if it sees some kind of element that it doesn't recognize, not to error out, but rather to just let it go, because in this case, we're going to say that those are custom elements that should be there. Once we do all that, we would get a folder structure that looks like this. We've got apps with our two different kinds of applications, and then our libs folder. This is kind of a simple setup for an NX workspace, but it goes a lot further than this. And if you want more information, Jeff Cross is here in the front row. He'd be happy to tell you a bunch more stuff, I'm sure. And I hope that I got everything right and that he doesn't get mad at me after this. But nonetheless, if you want to check something out that's going to give you some help when using Angular and React together and Angular elements, I would highly recommend checking out NX. All right, so we want to give a special thanks to a couple people. That's Yuri and Manfred. They've got some great content on Angular elements. So Yuri's got a series on Egghead that I'd highly recommend checking out to show you how all the technical points about how to set up your elements. Manfred's got some great written content on his blog as well. Links to everything are at this link. So you've got ngde elements. At this bit.ly link, that'll take you to the slides, and you can get everything there. And then this is my blog, ryanchenkie.com, and if you're interested in security for your Angular application, I've got a book on that topic. It's at ngauthbook.com. And that's it. So once again, I'm Ryan. This is me on Twitter.
I'm Brad. This is me on Twitter, Sonic Park.
And thanks so much for having us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.